Unless you're already living in your basement and you're completely cut off from society and from the news and everything else that's going on today, you've probably noticed that the sky is already starting to fall. And maybe even start to think about it being time that you started up a survival garden or you started to prep. Because things are changing. People around the world are dying already, and it's not because of a viral infection. And countries that are already struggling with famine and starvation are being pushed over the edge. And even in the US and in the UK, food shortages are starting to show up in the form of empty shelves and empty freezers in the supermarket. Have you ever thought about all the different scenarios in which you could be able to be forced to actually grow and produce your own food? Because there's a lot more of them than you likely to have thought or that you may think. And they're not conspiracy theories. Welcome back to Renegade News. I'm your host, Glenn Kowalski. Every week on this channel, you're going to find the latest news, strategies, and tactics on how to break free from the system, pay less tax, and how to live anywhere in the world that you want. So let's dive right into it. Because if you think that stores and food are going to always be readily available, the following message should really have you shaking to your core. Because here are 7 non-conspiracy theory scenarios that might have you having to survive without having shops and readily available to food. And these are all things that we're starting to see happen in the news right now today. I mean, there's unemployment through loss of a job or underemployment. There's hyperinflation with the cost of goods going through the roof. There's an economic downturn. And how can we not have economic downturns with business failures and money being printed like mad in all these countries and people being forced out of work? All of these things contribute to a potential economic crash and depression to the point where it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when are these going to happen, because we know that a severe economic event is on the horizon. There's also things like crop failure that's happening already, California famines, and here in Panama, we've had flooding that's wiped out crops like crazy. Drought and frost and pests are all taking their toll on the crops that were already growing. There's also a transportation crisis already in the works. There's trucker strikes. In Canada, there was mandates that have been refused, but in Canada, they're not letting truckers from the US who haven't been vaccinated into the country. But not all truckers are getting vaccinated, so they're protesting. How can this not cause supply shortages, which are already happening when the truckers are pushing back on this already? The same things are happening in the States with the truckers protesting. There's also fuel costs going through the roof and extra regulation that's stopping people from even getting into the business. There's also, and these are getting a little bit more farther down the road, we hope, but still possible, there's long-term grid down potential, electromagnetic pulse, a solar flare, or a cyber attack, which are we really that far from when you have people like the World Economic Forum performing crises scenarios and simulations based on cyber attacks taking out the monetary supply? Well, what we've seen in the past is real events tend to follow fairly closely what the World Economic Forum is practicing for. There's conspiracy theories about that. I'm not even going to get into that today. Think what you want about that. We know that there are potential possibilities. There's also regular supply shortages from war, increased demand as the population grows. There's embargoes on different countries and different rules because of the trade situations that are going on and the trade shortages we're already seeing. And we know that these are all possible scenarios that could be disastrous, because if you're not self-sufficient already, you have to look and remember how food actually gets to the table of you and to most people who aren't self-sufficient. For example, if there's no farm laborers out there milking the cows and feeding the pigs and collecting the eggs, none of that stuff is ever going to get to the market. And there's shortages in all of those areas already. There's already problems getting food processing and packaging because there's not enough workers available. And with the pandemic situation, these packers are being shut down because they're not considering these packer workers essential. And after they get shut down, even if they come back in, a lot of people are choosing not to go back to work. Then you have to follow the supply chain further down the line to where we have trucks and ships and airplanes. We already talked about the truck mandates and the truck protests that are going on, but ships and airplane are being grounded constantly. Thousands of flights are getting canceled, and that's all disrupting the deliveries of fresh food to the supermarkets and to the restaurants that need them. And what's going on is that some of the food retailers that aren't open are struggling to shift supplies, because in the past, many of the food supplies that they created will go to restaurants. Well, now restaurants are closing. They're going out of business left and right. The restaurants that are staying open are operating on decreased capacity due to blocking out certain people who are undesirable because they haven't received certain medical procedures. And all of these things are slowing down the restaurant supply, and the farmers and the suppliers are trying to shift to the grocery supplies instead, but that all changes their built-in logistics, making things more difficult for them. And that all comes together to create more shortages for the consumer. In the longer term, this lack of labor that we're seeing already today, and that's going to affect the planting today, but then down the line, there's harvesting that's going to be delayed because of it. And there's going to be obviously less harvesting to do. And it all becomes this domino effect that creates these food shortages, and also on the other end creates these rising prices for staple crops like corn and soy. And again, this domino effect comes into place where these crises develop a little bit at a time. But we've seen it before. We've seen it in many countries over a decade ago, where these supply shortages in certain staples cause these crises to just explode and turn into an avalanche. And more importantly than even that is, even if there is food available, the governments, through stimulus spending and trying to keep their economies going, they're printing money and over like crazy with these funds, and that's causing hyperinflation already. And if you don't understand how hyperinflation works, that's the topic of a whole other video, but you're already seeing it in food prices going up, and that's accelerating at a rapid pace to the point where eventually it's just going to make it unaffordable for anybody but the super wealthy to even afford food. So given all that, and given what's going on, you might be wondering, okay, so what do you have to do? How do you actually prepare and create these survival gardens? Do you need to be a farmer? Do you have to move off grid and into the woods? What's the next step? And fortunately, it's not something that you have to move off grid to do, but you do have to be prepared for it. And there's some certain principles that you have to understand in order to survive this potential disaster. And the first one is to realize that failure is not an option. When your survival depends on your success in your garden, you can't risk it, and you can't start playing around and experimenting with untried theories or going in with inexperience. You want to start learning how to do this properly now. Because, and the next reason is, there's limited time. And just because the life and the world seems to be collapsing all around us right now, it doesn't mean that suddenly, a little while from now, you're going to have a whole lot more time on your hands, that you're going to need to start babysitting your plants, and then all of a sudden you're going to be able to do nothing but focus on the survival garden. You need to find methods right now that provide a maximum return with the least amount of input from you, because right now you're still working, but even in a survival situation, there's other things that you're going to want to be able to do other than just tend to your plants. There's also a potential for limited water, and it may be possible that the irrigation water in your city can't keep up. I'm in Panama today. We have no city water. We happen to have a bank-up tank, and our pumps are running, so we have water, but that water supply will eventually run out. Hopefully we'll have city water to fill that up again. But it's easy to see when we live here because we've experienced the water shortages. But even up in Canada, we had water shortages where the water was being rationed because there wasn't enough of it. They couldn't get enough of it through the treatment systems. So as the economy continues to collapse, these water and irrigation problems become a much bigger reality, and you need water to keep your plants hydrated. So you want to plan on planting methods and growing methods that don't require as much water. And there is technology that helps you get through with less and less water. And that's super important if it's a garden that you want to rely on for your survival. Next is the potential for limited resources. There may not be gasoline available to power your rototillers, or gas prices could just go through the roof, $5 or $10 a gallon, which is very reasonable. Canada's getting close to that. Europe is already over that price. So as the resources for the gas go up, the availability goes down. There's also things like fertilizers and pesticides that you may just not be able to get. They just may not be available, not be able to get tools in the future. So you need to plan in advance to have what you need and the techniques that you need to learn in order to grow naturally without those extra chemicals. You also have to consider your growing season because you need to eat every day of the year. But depending on where you live, you may only be able to realistically produce a crop for a few months of the year. So you need to learn how to extend that growing season for as long as you possibly can. And then you need to learn how to preserve as much as that harvest you can to last you throughout the year. And these are all things that you can do, but you need to learn how to do it now. You also need protection for your garden because that garden bounty may be at risk from others that I'm going to talk about in a sec. And you could be having difficulties with critters who want to devour that work. There's always pests you have to deal with and, animals and insects. But there's also people. And you want to be prepared to protect or disguise the fact that you have those goods because it really comes down to safety. I mean, in a disaster scenario, you have to look out for your family and your friends first. And that might sound harsh, but it is reality. And because most people, most of your neighbors, I'll be blunt about it, they're not going to have prepared adequately. And that means that your foes and your enemies are going to increase in this situation. It's just a fact. It's not something we want to talk about. It's not something that we want to think about. But understand that that's going to happen. It's not even a question. People who are starving are going to become desperate, and your friends and your family come first. So what type of plants and what type of survival garden do you need to grow? Well, there's obviously a lot of details there that we have to get into, but here are a few things that you need to think about. The first thing is that it really should be a calorie-intensive garden, or one of your gardens should be a calorie-intensive garden, because calories are so critical for your energy and your bodily functions. These are your survival foods. You want potatoes. You want avocados if you're in the type of climate that can grow them. You want things like nuts and dry beans and green beans, sweet potatoes, sunflower seeds, peas, corn, carrots, and beets. And these are all things that can help you meet your basic nutritional requirements. And they give you things like protein and fat and vitamin minerals and those all-important calories. The next thing that you want to think about is outside of your survival garden, but one of the things that you want to think about is having survival livestock. So we're going to talk about the easiest one and one that I recommend everybody get into right now, just because it's a lot of fun and it's a good learning opportunity and it's so important. And that's chickens. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but I want to talk about how chicken food should be the next garden that you're growing to be able to sustain them. Things like Swiss chard, kale, fodder beets, and beet greens. And those are all specifically for chickens. And having these chickens, they can provide you with fresh eggs year round. And they're full of calories, they're full of proteins, and they're full of fat, all these things that you need. And like I said, they are a lot of fun. My chickens wander in and out of my office all the time, and they're just a blast, and they're just a great companion to have around. But they're so important as the food supply breaks down. You also want to have a supplemental nutrient garden. And that garden is designed specifically to supplement you with long-term food storage items, things like wheat, rice, oats, pasta, potato flakes, those types of things that are not necessarily a separate garden by themselves, but are ways of preserving the food that you can then combine with fresh ingredients to provide kind of those missing vitamins that you need, especially in the off season, things like vitamin A and vitamin C. You're also going to want an emotional boost garden, which is things like leafy greens and herbs and tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, onions, berries, and fresh fruits, and all those other favorites that your family loves and craves. It also increases their nutrition, but providing that emotional satisfaction, in addition to your basic staples, can make everything more bearable. When you're living in a survival situation, you're living off of freeze-dried food, it's really going to be really hard to stay motivated and upbeat as life becomes difficult. Those emotional foods can make such a big difference in your life, in your quality of life, and in your energy as you're surviving these situations that could come down the pipe, and as you saw earlier, are very likely to come down on us at some level at some point in the future. My friend James is the guy who really got me into this stuff, and he is just an amazing permacultural expert, and he's also a survival garden pro. He has a couple of programs that are just off the charts good, and I'm going to paste a link to them in the comments for you to go check out if you like. I think you would really enjoy it, and you definitely have to learn this stuff, and James is the guy that you want to learn this from for sure. But what about you? Do you already have a survival garden? Are you growing anything at all? Do you have a garden at all? What do you plan on doing if the supply of readily available food just suddenly drops off a cliff? Or do you think that I'm being, a tinfoil hat wearing crazy prepper for even thinking that it's possible? Let me know in the comments below. But remember, survival food is only one of the many strategies that you're going to need over the next few years. As the governments, start stepping up their draconian levels of control, they start printing their nation's dollars into the toilet. Well, on every week on Renegade News, we're adding new content to help you get through all of that by teaching you how to become as independent as possible from the system and how to find more freedom and liberty in this unfree world. So subscribe right now, the link's in the description, and don't forget to watch the video that you see on the screen right now for the latest news, information on the best places to live, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and so much more. I'm Glenn Kowalski from Renegade News, and I'll see you over there.